Thank you for joining us again. And a big thank you to those who have tapped subscribe, shared it with a family and friends. Welcome, Nathan Rozarieux, fisheries consultant from St Ives in Cornwall. Hi, Nathan.
Good afternoon. Very good, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Where did life begin for you?
I was actually born in Germany because my dad was in the British Army at the time, but most of my life I can remember growing up in St Ives from about the age of 2. So my early life in St Ives and haven't been really too far from it ever since. I was very lucky. My mum is Cornish family through and through, and we had 3 family houses on the seafront at St Ives within probably about 400 meters. My great gran, my gran, and my auntie. So any time I could was spent hanging around down the harbour and just gravitating between one of the 3 houses, depending on what sweets or what food was available. So it was a pretty good childhood.
Excellent, excellent. Sounds that way. And where did your studies, where did they start and lead you to?
I guess I was coerced would be the polite way of saying that I was into studying. Basically, like I think many people involved with the industry, I cut my teeth in and around small boats from a young age, and first would be scullying punts around the harbour, and then you kind of graduate into a bit of single-handed fishing. So I had my own little mackerel boat when I was about 13 after fishing a bit with my uncle, and I really enjoyed this, and I was lucky enough grew up with 3 or 4 friends who are all fishing still, and so we had a fierce rivalry, but great friendship. And so obviously growing up, all I ever wanted to do was finish school and go fishing. But my mum had kind of different ideas. She didn't support that plan particularly. Her family in distant generations had lots of fishing history, but she said that's fine if you want to go fishing, but you should really plug away at school and try and study first. So probably against my better judgment, but with hers, I ended up did my GCSEs and then did some A levels and ended up doing a marine ecology and fish biology course at Plymouth University for 3 years, a degree course. So that was good for me. It's, in later life, certainly some of the things I've done, that kind of grounding in fishery science and such like, and just the world of research has done me no harm. So I am, although I probably wasn't that grateful to her at the time, I am more so now.
Yeah, it's fantastic taking as much as you can on board. And it's amazing how when you get older, you never lose it.
And you just keep adding to it. I find, all sorts of things. That's what I love about the fishing industry the most is here, I'm still have that thirst for information and people sharing stories or knowledge and information, and even learning from different countries but different people even. And then some of the younger guys who obviously are far better at using technology, and you can even learn things. So yeah, I love being open-minded and just absorbing things as you go along. So that's, I guess, something that I've enjoyed. It's maybe not unique to this industry, but it feels like it probably is.
Yeah, yeah. You obviously had good advice from your father and mother along the way. What did they do?
My dad was he say he was in the army. He was a radio engineer for he used to work on helicopters in the army, and then came out, worked in the civil service, and basically was still doing radios and communications for the fire brigade, police, or emergency services really, and latterly the RNLI pages, which he greatly enjoyed, going around all of the different lifeboat stations in Cornwall to do these jobs. He thought was a great gig, so that was fine. And My mum mostly worked. She worked a bit for the local council, and then was manager of a building society that had a shop in town. But they were pretty focused on parenting as well. Myself and my brother, I think we had a good education from them, but also a good sort of work ethic as well, and I think a healthy respect for people as well. I think it's often not just about what you know, but how you conduct yourself. And I always like to think that you know, try and be fair and be treated the same way back. So yeah, so I think they did a pretty good job. I'm sure they disagree.
I'm sure they would agree. It's interesting that from they're obviously very stable jobs and careers and that, and I can understand why they wouldn't be so keen on their son going into something as roller coaster as the fishing industry can be.
Yeah, they were always very keen to point out people that hadn't made it big. But you know, as a youngster, I was always pointing out someone that had just had a bumper landing or had built a new boat. At that time, sort of middle late 1980s, Cornwall was really booming with the kind of gillnet fishing taking off. But yeah, say my mum's, I guess it was her great granddad, um, had three boats in St Ives at the turn of the last century, when obviously fishing was big for pilchards and herring. The family had three boats, but then he had two daughters, and then they had daughters as well. So the kind of fishing legacy that I could have had in terms of some boats never happened. But yeah, they're having lived in, you know, my mum say she was is a St Ives girl, born and bred, lived a few yards from the harbour, and remembers fish being sold on the slipway, but has seen fishing in good and bad times, seen all of the peaks and troughs over the years. You know, the long lining that was very big for a time, and then that went away. And she remembers the French boats fishing here and coming into the harbour, and all different things through the years. They just remember the bad bits, but as you say, I always pick out the good bits.
Yeah, that's great. And so it's really your fishing career started as a fisherman.
Yeah, very much so. Like I say, I was my uncle was in a partnership. They had a 21, 22 foot French crabber, and originally she was actually built for she's wood, built for catching crawfish off of Madagascar. They used to carry six of these, we call them toshers, on these big boats that used to sail. We're talking probably the early 1960s. Anyway, they were, my uncle and his partners in this boat were very friendly with the French crabbers that used to come to St Ives. So they had all the contacts. So they went over to France and they bought this boat at an auction at the end of the season. They'd auctioned these boats off, and she got towed home. And the story of towing her home was that they'd lost her in the channel about three times. They parted off the tow rope, and it was foggy, so they were searching around trying to find this boat
Oh,
that they just
gee.
bought. But anyway, they found her. They brought her home. She was called the Galilee. So yeah, that's my early memories fishing. She had an air-cooled Lister, which was always incredibly loud, and they had a little aft kind of Dodger. So when it was wet or spraying, you did two of you, maybe three, almost squeezed into this phone box with this air-cooled Lister rattling away, which is probably why my hearing isn't as good now as it should be. But no, growing up with them, um, it was a different pace, but it was almost all mackerel fishing. They had a few lines. There was still a spur dog fishery, but really I came in on the back of that, even though I was probably about, when I started fishing with them, probably about 9 or 10 years old. But the spur dog was just at the end of the lines and the nets were starting to come in, so that tailed off. But so I fished with them, as I said, until I could have my own boat. I think it was about 13, and that was pretty much mackerel. Although they say all my friends had boats, so we did plenty of netting, and we we played around with lines as well for rays and stuff. So there was always something to do, and say always through, even when I was at college, fishing in my in my holidays was always what I wanted. what I did. I wanted to do and did so. And when I finished university, I went fishing, and as well as having my own boat, working from Newlyn then in the winter time. Did some trips on some bigger boats as well. So it was a good way in, and working from Newlyn was a different league to St Ives. St Ives was very small, and you go to Newlyn and your boat feels like it's a punt. But just the scale of it, and even then it was still buzzing. Full of characters, full of stories, full of industry. It's all of the attraction. So that was great times. That would have been probably the early 1990s.
You briefly mentioned the pilchards, and as very much an onlooker, I actually thought, what a master stroke calling them Cornish sardines. For marketing wise, that must have been a master stroke.
It was genius, yeah, and I think pretty much down to one guy you may have had on the show earlier, but probably haven't. And if you haven't, it'd be worth getting on, because Nick Howell really should have his place in modern folklore, because it was he really that restarted the cannery in Newlyn, which was a working museum type operation. But the fishery was, in the late 90s, it was less than 10 tons landed per year, and it was just a very boutique thing, really. And then he started these tins, the canned Cornish sardines, which he managed to get them, I think, into Waitrose and a few other kind of top end supermarkets, and they went well. But then he started working with Marks and Spencers, and they were just saying, we can't get people away from this negative thought about pilchard being, it's in a tin, it's pilchards, it's almost like prison food. It's the low end food, and Nick was switched on, and he's a bright guy, and he said, well, these are, the Latin name is Sardinus pilchardus. These are the very same species as our cousins in Biscay catch and sell as sardines, and many people we know started going on holiday, Spain, Portugal, and will have nothing better than a plate of sardines for starters or for their meal. So he really twigged that. So between him and that relationship to start with Marks and Spencers, it really was a pivotal moment in this generation of fishing in Cornwall. And obviously we know since then that the fishery is completely revived with newer vessels, some very high tech processing factories, and although obviously the fishermen have invested in the vessels and the gear, and the processors have invested big in the processing, so really a lot of this has been down to Nick and that kind of foresight also to bring on board people like the MSC to make sure that kind of eco label excuse me was there. So yeah, he's definitely played his part in that story.
That's and it's gone right through, obviously right through the industry, and it's a win-win for everybody.
100%. Yeah, it's, like say, it's, I don't know, the fishery I think last year supports about 5,000 tons now. But also the UK market share has grown as well. So virtually every major supermarket will have Cornish sardine lines. Obviously at the start, a lot of the fish was being frozen and exported, but now a lot of the restaurants here will be doing them. So yeah, it's been a saviour in a way, as some of the other fisheries have come under pressure. This fishery, say from probably the very late 1990s, 1999, 2000, and thereon, has been something of a big success.
Brilliant, brilliant. Going on, Nathan, although you're saying you started off as a fisherman, you must have grown up into it very quickly and very much over the years, because you're now a board member of Seafish, and that's a brilliant organisation.
Yeah, it's strange. I'm one of the not the only one, but I'm one of the few board members ever that's been an employee of Seafish. Twice. I had a short stint working for them when they were in Hull as a training advisor, and then when we had Seafood Cornwall set up down here, which was very much an equivalent of Seafish Scotland, albeit on a smaller scale. That was hosted for and partly paid for by Seafish. So it was an organisation that I've known and respected over the years, and yeah, it was certainly. So I think I'm the longest serving board member on there now. So I'm just coming up for my 7th year. So this will be, I think, next March is I think my time is up. But yeah, it's it's a fantastic organisation. It's had its problems along the way with various court cases and things like that. But I think the identity's there, and what it still has is some very good people, very knowledgeable people. So I always say, if you get stuck, ring. If you have gear troubles, then you ring someone like David Warwick or someone on the gear stuff taken over from Mike Montgomery. The knowledge those guys have is, I would say, priceless. These incredible resource to tap into. We're lucky to have it. So yeah, I've been glad to play a little part in these things. It's always for me, as a board member of any organisation, find it quite hard not to get too involved in the day-to-day operational stuff, and have to be reminded that it's you have to have more of a kind of oversight and a strategic view and that of things. But that's just because I'm keen. But yeah, no. So that's been a good role, and more recently, the last, I think, 3 years. Trustee of the Fisherman's Mission as well, which I greatly enjoy. It's a fantastic charity that the more I see of it, the more I respect the people. We all know, we've been around fishing long enough, that sadly accidents happen, and sadly as well, some of them are fatal. And I've seen firsthand how the mission operates and can pick up the pieces of people's lives being absolutely shattered after a loss of life, family tragedy. I know I couldn't do it. Some of the things they do, I wouldn't be able to do. And I take my hat off to them working in that environment. And a very lean charity as well. That's what's nice about being involved with a charity like that, is it's not massively, supported on overheads. It's very lean. Most of the money gets spent where it should. So yeah, so I'm glad to do my little bit there as well.
I think it's a fantastic organisation, and I've done a lot of fundraising with the mission up here. And the thing that I often found, it was unfortunate in a way for them, and this is maybe not very good, but it's the way I would describe it. When the lifeboat would be called out, of course, bright colour, going at speed out the bay, all local lads on board, so everybody would be seeing it, and people knew about it, and they would be watching. And maybe they would be out, pick somebody up injured or sick, or there's been a problem and there's more than one, and in they come. This lifeboat comes in with the injured crewmen from a ship, say. Here comes the mission. The mission take the people ashore and look after them, and nobody ever sees that.
Yeah. It's certainly not as glamorous, yeah, and I support the RNLI as well, 100%, and have done fundraisers and stuff for them. But you're right, they've certainly got the visual side, and say all of that stuff, and the unglamorous, unfortunately, sometimes bits of some of the mission work. Some of it's tough. It's really, as I say, it's unsung heroes would be the word I would use. But so I wouldn't take away anything from those seagoing either. But they've both got their role to play. But in terms of fundraising, I totally agree with what you're saying. It's very hard to try and compare, because they're apples and pears. But when you're shaking the tin and you try and explain to people what they actually do, I think those that take the time to understand, they kind of get it. But on the first visual, it's a hard sell.
Yeah. Going on from there, Nathan, what's your views on the pros and cons of floating offshore wind?
The floating offshore wind is an interesting one. Obviously, it's a very hot topic at the moment. It seems that whichever flavour of government people support, really. I think they've all very much nailed their colours to the mast as being very strong supporters of floating offshore wind. So first, on a principle basis of net zero and reducing our carbon outputs, I think we all have to agree that should be a societal goal. But I think governments are actually thinking a little beyond that, actually, in terms of offshore renewables. I think at the moment, I think it's a stat that Mike Cohen, I've heard quote from Mike Cohen from the NFFO, has quoted that for the current round of if all of the projects that are currently being talked about were to come forward and be built, then the UK would have a 400% overcapacity of energy. So it does seem to me that it's almost a Trojan horse. So the Trojan horse is, this gets wheeled in as being the solution to our global warming issues, but actually the motives are slightly more sinister. And I think we have governments that are desperate for an economy to have big industry. We don't have a lot, and we're scaling back on oil and gas, which obviously they had some good revenues out of the North Sea for the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I think this for them is seen as the next big thing. They can really see this as being providing the sort of income as a nation, as nations, that we need to prop up our economy, to be blunt. So it's very difficult. So in terms of net zero, yeah, that's fine. I've got nothing against renewables. I think the problem from a fishing industry point of view we have is that the planning process doesn't recognise fishing. Fishing is not a statutory consultee. So when the Crown Estate issue leasing rounds and they offer areas of the seabed up for a 25-year lease, they talk to the RYA, or they talk to marine aggregates, or they talk to the Chamber of Shipping, all these different stakeholder groups who have an interest in the seas and in navigation, but they don't talk to fishing. And so the fishing industry typically gets involved in the planning process when lines on charts have already been drawn, and from there on in really fighting a bit of a rearguard action, trying to defend itself and explain the way that the ground is used. And some of the areas obviously in this current round that have been talked about are highly productive fishing grounds, some of the richest fishing grounds that we have as a country. So the scale we're talking with offshore wind is getting, for me, quite scary. And the added complication, I think, of floating offshore wind versus the kind of more traditional monopile turbines that we're kind of used, we're used to seeing a few more of those inshore in different areas, around the kind of Whitehaven area, but also all down the east coast of Bridlington, places like that. The offshore wind, as you can imagine, almost like an oil rig platform, has to have an anchor array in place. So the actual area taken out by the floating platforms, floating turbines, would be much bigger. And the real hot topic that nobody, the elephant in the room, no one really wants to talk about yet, is the fact that there can be no return to fish once those have been built. It's very difficult to foresee a trawler or a beam trawler or any sort of fishing gear sensibly, safely, and in an economically viable way, fishing back within some of these wind farms once these floating turbines, just because of the amount of cabling that's going to be out, linking the various platforms, but also the anchor arrays and all this stuff. So in effect, huge areas of the seabed won't be fishable. And I think that's the issue that the fishing industry has woken up to. The SFF and the NFFO in recent weeks actually have come out very strongly on this issue, which is a good thing. And I think fishermen probably need to raise their voices on the matter as well, because I don't see enough, my own personal view, I don't see enough resistance and pushback on this. I see it as a kind of game changer for the next generation, and it will potentially completely change the shape of the fishing industry in this country. So it's a grave concern. And on a more local almost parochial level, the frustration that I have, and I know it's shared by other people here, is that, we have our own council. We have Cornwall Council aiding and abetting and funding organisations that are seeking to move floating offshore wind forward at the expense of one of the most traditional industries we have. Tin mining shaped the landscape of Cornwall, but the seaside, the seascape, the coastline has been totally shaped by fishing for hundreds of years. And to kind of just steamroller that, for me, as a adopted Cornishman, shall I say, it, I'm not going to lie, it makes my blood boil.
You've every reason to feel that way. It's exactly the same as far north as we are. We've got now like a Beatrice Field, and the Murray Firth is absolutely full of wind turbines. Whereas in a fisherman's mind, that was the Smith Bank, one of the most best fishing grounds in the Highlands in the north. And now there's proposals for the north side, just west of Orkney, north of Caithness here. And they're looking at the same thing. But I can remember my father, a cousin of mine, as a fisherman. He's in 88 now, so that's his fishing days. He fished. They all fished. All the boats from here fished the Stormy Bank, and that was a real well-known, prolific fishing ground. That's going to be gone to offshore wind.
Yeah, no, it just seems that it's such a high level government priority. I mean, this needs to be, we, the industry, needs to fight it. And the real shame I find, because it's very easy to fall into a stereotype and be accused. I get accused of being too parochial in my views on issues like this, but I respond to that and say there are areas, the fishing industry has identified areas that are less fished that would perhaps be suitable for this type of activity, but because we're involved too late, those areas are not put forward. And as you say, the actual grounds at the moment, the ones that I see being proposed, north and south, they are productive fishing grounds. They have significant, tens of millions of economic value. And we know from socioeconomic research that organisations like the Cornish FBO have done, that for every one job at sea, there's another 8 jobs ashore, and all of the economic multipliers all of that money resides in the local communities, and it supports local people. Whereas the myth that we get fed is that floating offshore wind is going to bring jobs and money. And all I see at the moment is wind farm companies being tempted to develop turbines with a 200% subsidy, for want of a better word. So they're attracted in with a subsidy to make electricity, which they're then going to put back onto the grid and sell to us, who are the taxpayer that paid the money to the government that paid the subsidy. So it seems absolutely crazy situation. And we know that these turbines, the steel, all of the materials used to make them, this won't come from the UK. They'll be manufactured abroad where labour is cheaper, and they will be towed into position. You're probably using foreign-owned tugs and vessels, support boats. They'll be anchored up, connected to the grid, and we'll never see people again. So this whole nonsense about local jobs and communities, I'm afraid I don't buy into that.
No, well, I have to say I agree with everything you said. One of the things that is asked here all the time by local people with is land and sea. How come they put them on the loveliest beauty spots and the best fishing grounds?
Yeah, yeah, you couldn't make it up.
Yeah.
And they say and I guess the thing where I have some fun on social media, because I think you have to use it as fun sometimes, not take it too seriously, but it is serious. But I'm so disappointed that how silent some of these big NGOs are, because we've both seen over the years NGOs have a lot to say about fishing, and in the grand scheme of things, some of the impact of the things they might not like about fishing are like a grain of sand compared to the impact of these things scaled up and the way that they will be. And yet these supposed guardians of the environment are mute on this issue, and that frustrates me. I think, it's, again, I'm not opposed to these things. I just think they have to be looked at through the same lens as people view the fishing industry or any other industry on the sea. They all need to be treated the same. Because of the money, I think, that's involved, that doesn't seem to be the case at the moment.
No, and I agree with the term you used that could be very suspicious. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, no, there's. I think we're only just getting into it, and like I say, I've been greatly buoyed by Ellsworth MacDonald, the SFF, and Mike Cohen, the NFFO. In recent weeks, they've actually come out fighting, but I've seen some great, very intelligent comments, and so I feel slightly more satisfied that now the sort of proper debate can happen, and I hope more and more people will become involved. And again, I'm not against these things. I just want them to be discussed properly, with, as you say, the pros and cons being out there for all to see.
I know that I've seen a piece in social media. Elspeth MacDonald was talking at their recent dinner just either last night or the night before, and she was going on about that being a real issue for the fishing industry. And by good luck, she had Swinney, our Scottish First Minister, there
That's
in
right.
the room. So,
No,
I thought, well done her.
100% agree. No, I think it's great, and she's a fantastic ambassador for the industry in Scotland, and very smart, and it's good because far better with words than me. So they won't let these people wriggle off the hook. They'll be held to task, which is what they should be.
Yeah, yeah. Nathan, do you believe it was right for the pulse fishing to be banned?
A good question. Probably the wrong person to ask, just because I'm just going to say, fortunately, we weren't exposed to that in the southwest. It was really only in the southern North Sea and parts of the North Sea, so we never really had too much exposure to the pulse beam. Obviously, it was a hugely controversial method, and again, I think heavily subsidised by the Dutch government. We know, the Dutch have significant beam trawl fleet, and the price of fuel must have been eye-watering. Well, I assume it made them economically unviable, and they were either faced with decommissioning or looking at vessels such as the pulse beam. So I say I'm going to say, completely as a non-expert on this issue, because I've never been asked and never had the time to delve too deep into it. Intrinsically, more as a fisherman, it feels wrong, and what I've seen doesn't I don't agree with it. It doesn't sound the way that we should be doing things. It sounds almost like dynamite fishing, when you just kill things indiscriminately. That doesn't seem to me to be acceptable. I guess the only thing, one of the things that's happened as a result of pulse beaming being banned, is that more vessels have gone over to fly shooting. The Dutch style of fly shooting, I would say, because it's on a huge scale. These vessels, the amount of rope that they work and the size of gear is probably not something that would be, the same as seine net in its roots in Scotland. And we've seen those boats come down the channel and all the way down, and there's no question, again, they have a huge fishing power. Some of those ex beam trawler 2,000 horsepower kind of beamers with 4 kilometers of 50 mil rope and stuff. It's heavy metal beaming, shall I call it, and heavy metal seining. That's not popular with fisher folk here. They seem to, there doesn't seem to be not a lot of evidence to support that. I should say, I should be completely fair, but again, intrinsically, I think these vessels supposedly fishing for non-precious stock species, non-quota species, because they don't have a lot of quota in the area, and it's almost inconceivable, knowing what we know about the mixed fishery we have, that they're not catching probably significant quantities of roundfish quota species. So I don't know what's happening to those. So yeah, I guess everything has a kind of knock-on effect, and the unintended consequence of banning pulse beaming was the greater evolution of the the seine net into this whole bigger scale of fishing. So, but yeah, I say I'm not the expert, but it strikes me as wrong when you kill everything in your path. That doesn't seem like fishing to me.
Yes, that's right. But on the other hand, a fisheries scientist in Iceland, Jon Christensen, who I've done a few podcasts with, as he says, if you protect a predator, well, there's a knock-on effect.
Yeah, that's the joy of fishing, and even tweaking different gear types and saying, oh, this versus that is, it will have an impact somewhere down the line that one of the species, predator or prey, will benefit from a certain measure, and so that's what makes, I guess, fisheries management, fisheries science so difficult, is we don't fully understand them all either. We think we have a good idea of some things, but it's quite a complex food web that we live in, and trying to foresee all of the outcomes is really, really tricky.
When we're on the subject of ban, what about the MMOs announcing seasonal closure of the crayfish fishery in English waters? What's your view on that?
For me personally, massively frustrating. Crawfish, again, let's say, just going back to my childhood, and I said my great-grand, she lived one door up from the top of the quay, so she lived on the harbour. The back of her house was straight into the sea. So I would spend my younger years looking out the window, watching boats coming and going, and because St Ives is a tidal harbour, every other week the boats would land their shellfish, and the tide would be out, so they'd have to scully or row in a punt to their store pots that were at the back of the quay to land their crawfish, and then probably everywhere they were landing into tea chests. So the tea chest was landing, and they would be full of crawfish. So I would have been maybe about 5 or 6, but I would always be run down there and watch, tea chest after tea chest of crawfish coming in, being landed. Obviously, the nets then were polypropylene. It was before the mono nets, and the fishermen used to mend them at the end of each tide on the quay. They'd mend them with twine, so there was always fishermen on the quay mending on the spring tides. But so the crawfish fishing again was the kind of backdrop in St Ives to my childhood, and I've always had a real fascination with crawfish in the fishery, and it's something that I've turned to myself and been involved in crawfish, and from about 2011, 2012, been back into the crawfish fishery myself in the summertime, which is the season. But from around 2016, maybe 2014, 15, 16, that sort of time, there was already signs that the fishery was actually making a bit of a comeback. And at this time, there were very few boats fishing for crawfish because the stock had been taken right down. And then about 2018, 2019, there was huge surge of juvenile crawfish, very, very small, way under the minimum size, but you catch them in the gear, so you'd pick them out carefully and put them back alive. But I'm talking, you'd catch 100 a day. The numbers we were seeing was nothing that anyone in living memory, even people that were fishermen that were doing it in the late 60s, early 70s, could remember fishing this good. So it was very clear to me that we had something coming our way. Nature had dealt us a fantastic hand and real opportunity of a fishery. And so the various committees I was on at the time, Cornwall IFCA, and anyone that would be bothered to listen to me, which was probably not enough, I was saying, we really need to start putting measures in place to protect this fishery, because what we know from the past about crawfish is they're very susceptible to overfishing. They're quite easy to catch in nets, and the areas where they live around Cornwall are relatively small. So the fishery cannot sustain a high degree of fishing pressure ultimately, whether that's, number of boats or a number of nets or whatever metric you want to use. It can only take so much. But unfortunately, it seems to me that fisheries management in this country, and I've been around it for 25 or 30 years, and I'm struggling to think of any examples that it manages well when fisheries are on the ascendancy, when there's a clear, almost an explosion of the stock, but it needs safeguards because effectively we had an open fishery. So as long as boats had a shellfish license, there were no ever technical regulations or anything else in place to protect this booming stock from being overfished. So I think since then, although the CFPO and other fishermen and organisations have come more and more on board in recent years, and the MMO after 2 years of lobbying from industry, increased the minimum landing size, and last year had its first attempt at a closed season, and this year a closed season. In both cases, 80% of the fishermen wanted a longer closure, and certainly myself and a few others were actually saying, well, that's one thing, but that's just one tool in the toolbox we actually need to limit the number of boats. If you don't limit the number of boats, then surely you're destined for failure. And there needed to be some sort of cap on the number of boats or licenses, because say an open access fishery is doomed. So I think they've come to the party late, and they've moved so slowly because just don't seem to understand the urgency that fish stocks, the way that the fishermen basically can't keep up with fishermen. Fishermen move and react very, very quickly. If they see a different type of gear, or if they see a new fishing opportunity emerging, they are hunters, and they're onto things very, very quickly. And the regulators are 2, 3, 4 steps behind. And so, sadly, and I'm going to say I am gutted, because it's a fishery that I love more than anyone, and it's part of what I almost believe that it should be for me, but for any generation. I just have a bad feeling that the future is pretty bleak, because we've got lots of boats, big and small, from all over, fishing a relatively small area, and the stock just will not sustain it. And so within a year or two, I think we're going to see some drastic reductions. And that to me is such a waste. We got given a massive opportunity. And as I said, and that's because we are so used to managing things in decline. We always had cod recovery or hake recovery. When stocks have fallen away and we have to rebuild them, this was the opposite challenge. We had a stock that was coming back, but we needed to look after it and make sure that it wasn't overfished, and we failed.
And do you think it is overfished? And do you think there's evidence that a longer closure has helped in previous years? Has there been evidence that the closure helps? A longer closure helps?
I think a longer closure helps, or would help, because it would certainly just control the amount. The fishing effort up until about 2 or 3 years ago, the fishing effort from the traditional crawl boats, a small number of crawl boats that have been fishing for over a decade, couple of decades, Newquay, Newlyn, St Ives and Hale, and the Isles of Scilly, usually start around kind of May, June time, and then bring the nets in this time of year, probably middle of October, because the ground being worked is all quite hard, relatively shallow, and we're obviously subject to such huge swells here that the gear would get absolutely smashed to pieces if it was left out during the winter months. So the traditional fishing pattern has always been to bring the gear in, and that's coincided quite well with the fish themselves, because by October, a lot of the females that you catch are carrying their eggs then, so obviously we don't want to catch them, we put them back. And at the start of the season, so I say in May, June, the crawls are often just cast at that time of year, so they can be soft. Again, we put them back, they're not in great condition. So we've been trying to catch them and it's the right time to catch them, and leave them to hide up during the winter. But obviously with larger boats joining the fishery, and they're talking recently 2-3 years, they have tried to push and extend that fishing season, because obviously bigger boats, they're able to work more weather basically. So I think the seasonal closures are, I guess, more about trying to safeguard against more fishing outside of the season. But for me anyway, I think they play a part of it, but actually they play a small part. The increase in minimum landing size has been important. That's definitely, again, a significant part. But if you look at any fisheries management textbook, the FAO code on good fisheries management, you can't have open access to a fishery, and you need to control the amount. And again, it really doesn't matter whether you control the number of boats or the total amount of gear or a catch limit. We look at the Australians and how they've managed their spiny lobster fishery. It's very, very heavily regulated and managed, but it's very sustainable. It's they've got a very high value species which they manage well. Theirs, of course, is a pot fishery only, where the numbers of pots are limited and the number of licenses are limited. It's highly regulated, and I know I know fishermen don't like regulation, but the fishing technology and the power now, a 10-year-old in a rowing boat has more information on their mobile phone. If you look at Navionics or one of these fishing apps, which gives you a picture of the seabed that our ancestors would dream of, they fished their whole lives without knowing as much detail of the seabed as now that technology has opened up. So we need to give fish and shellfish a chance, because the collective fishing power, and obviously we've got mono nets and better net haulers than they had in the 70s. So yeah, it's a vulnerable species to overfishing, and I really hope that in 2 years' time someone comes around and tells me that I was barking mad and I got it all wrong. I'd like that to be the case, but I don't believe it will be. I think the story from here is going to be not very positive. I know some of the best fishermen in this fishery that have been doing it 2 or 3 generations that are thinking of selling their boats in the next few months. So those guys are good. They know the fishery inside and out. They're the top boats. And if the top boats are saying that sort of thing, then I listen to them.
You know, I've said earlier, I did a few podcasts with a guy, Jon Christensen in Iceland. I know him very well. And he's done studies all around the world. And he reckons that one of the consistent things that he's seen all around the world, as he says himself, is that if they reduce the effort to protect a species, the stocks go down. It doesn't. He reckons they need to be fished hard. He likens it to picking berries or fruit off wild berries off a tree. He says the harder you pick it, the more it grows. He says if you want if you want a tree to grow, what do? You cut it.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not familiar with his work. I don't know whether I personally not sure that works, just because of what we've seen around the UK with crab and lobster, particularly crab, since the boom in the Chinese market, where crabbing has gone to a whole new level because the price has moved it to that, and it's hard to foresee. I understand the concept. It's an ecological concept that I'm aware of, where you take some of the bigger ones out, and you certainly see that in populations where the fish population size of the individual starts to move down. But I'm not sure in shellfish. Again, I can only talk for this fishery, and we have history. We have history going back to the 1920s, 1930s, and have been documented. And there's 2 or 3 of these kind of episodic booms. I think Dr. Colin Bannister wrote a really good piece in the Fishing News a few months ago. He went back and looked at it, and he said, this happens, once every 30 or 40 years, you get this huge year class successful breeding that we don't know where it's come from. The larval stage of crawfish is 3 months, so it's a lot. The pelagic larval stage is a long time. So obviously in 3 months, it can travel a long way. So we could even be catching crawfish that, were spawned off the Iberian coast or the Bay of Biscay. But his view, like mine, is that we haven't learned from history. On each occasion that it's happened, we have allowed uncontrolled fishing to take away all of that crop, that harvest. We've harvested all of the fruit in one day, and I think we need to harvest these big year classes slightly more slowly, and allow a bit of a population to establish itself. But as you say, I don't know. That's my view of the kind of shellfish. But I don't doubt for other species that's true what he's saying.
Yeah, no, and obviously I'm not going to say it's the same for every species, and in particular it's haddock, the last chat we had, which is on a recent podcast I've released, and we had one of the best skippers in the area on the podcast with him, and it's haddock was the main concern. Now, we've taken various scale samples and sent it to him, and he's done an age test and that, and he reckoned one of the haddocks I sent him was 34 centimeters long, which is just the bare minimum size, just over the minimum size. 30 centimeters is a minimum size. This one was 34 centimeters. To look at it, Nathan, and you'll know exactly what I mean. Our spawning cycle, fish are spawning about any time between January, February, March. They're out of condition, and by May, they're starting to feed again and fatten up. This was done late June, July, and to look at the fish, you'd almost swear it was February or March. They were so
Still
thin.
racy.
And it measured 34 centimeters. It weighed only 267 grams. And he came back with the results. He said it was over 4 years old, almost 5, and it was fully grown. And he reckoned if that fish was in Iceland, it would have been over 2 kilos at that weight. Now he feels that we're not fishing hard. It's overpopulation, and starvation is a problem.
Competition for
Because
food. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know. I mean, we had a kind of haddock boom. Well, we called it here. We don't get a lot of haddock, but we did have a haddock boom about 10 years ago, and there was lots of scientists involved. And again, no one could ever tell you where these fish came from, but it was striking with haddock in particular that the kind of success of a recruitment, of a spawning, was almost inversely proportional to the size of the stock. So it seemed they had their biggest successful recruitment years when the spawning stock biomass was quite low. It was almost an inverse relationship, and there was definitely talk. I remember being involved in the hake recovery plan back in the early 2000s, that cannibalism in hake was a big issue. You know, the hake were eating a lot of the juveniles, and that's, you know, well recorded in science. So there's definitely these relationships out there, and like say, I agree that there is nature's way of managing things is, and you know, with the other problem we have is not being able to control some of the other predators like seals, but I guess that's a whole nother podcast. But yeah, we have a very narrow view when we look at fisheries management. It tends to be one species at a time, and it's, as we said earlier, it's more complex than that.
Well, it's interesting also when you were talking about the Australian model, and what it reminded me of here. I don't know about Cornwall, but certainly in Scotland, we have areas, and just say particularly in the west coast, sea lochs, there's a complete ban on any mobile gear, and there is no limit on the amount of creels. And I believe in some small areas, there's no mobile gear allowed, and there's 60,000 creels out. And they're actually fishing out their own future.
Yeah, I think for many years it seems to have been in the too difficult pile for fisheries managers to, you know, trawling is, you know, they kind of look at mesh size and vessel power and different parameters of trawling, and towed gears generally, they see, you know, numbers of dredges. They seem to have their head around the way to manage that. But static gear, as you say, you know, I can't think of any boat that doesn't work more nets or more pots than it did a decade ago. Very few, and you know, some you hear all sorts now of boats with 2 or 3 fleets of pots in the water, just astronomical numbers, and kind of, you know, industrial scale. I don't like using the term, but it is. It's not what fishing looks like for somebody like me. I don't see fishing as that way. But you're right. They've definitely not grasped the nettle of static gears. I think maybe the Channel Islands and some of the French inshore fisheries, they seem to have kind of cracked that, and they're so productive. You know, their catch per pot, the catch rates are so much higher. Whether we could ever get to that situation here, I don't know. It it'd be a painful journey. But if we are serious about managing fish stocks, and I'm not always convinced myself that we are, some of the things I've seen over the years, but if we are, then that's an area that definitely needs to be talked about. Limits on the amount of static gears. They cannot be allowed to proliferate. There has to be a maximum.
Something I always think about when I hear any of this sort of discussions, Nathan, I just wonder to myself, I don't have magic answers, but it certainly makes me think back. My father, during the year, course of his year, he would sea net for just a 54-foot wooden boat, uh, 88 horsepower Kelvin engine on board. And they would fish so much of the year for whitefish, obviously, and then they would spend the rest of the year on creels. Now, there were 5 crew on board. It was four brothers and a crewman. And you just wonder if the supply, it's obviously an industry of supply and demand, but if a clever guy could just put his finger on it and get it right, because they made a good living. Do you know how many creels they had? 100.
Yeah, can believe it. Yeah,
I'm talking in the 50s, early 60s.
Yeah, and that's the sort of thing that we read with the when you look back at the crawfish in the 60s when they were being potted. Even boats that were 4 or 5 hands, big boats, let's say 50-foot boats, they wouldn't have a lot of pots. And even until recently, I think the French crabbers, the nomadic French crabbers that would fish all around Cornwall and the southwest, they only fish what they can carry. And I think that's a great rule for that size of vessel, is that you only fish what you carry. We've lost sight of it, I think, with potting generally. The amount of gear and the cost of everything, it's not there. And as you say, actually, for all the intricacies, take one step back, then fisheries management should be relatively simple. But somehow we've made something that should be relatively simple, relatively the most complicated industry, I'm sure, to manage. You need a filing cabinet on board most of the boats now to keep all the bits of paper and rules that you're supposed to be adhering to. And often, people don't agree with them. And if people don't agree with things because they know that they don't make good they make good sense, then, they won't be adopted. So, yeah, we need a dose of common sense.
Yeah, what I should have added to that was when they had 100, and I think the very most they ever had out was 105. And you get a 2-man boat up our way now, you'll have upwards of 800 creels.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. 2, 3, 400 per man kind of thing. Small boats, even 19, 20 foot long with 2, 3, 400. It's seems crazy to me, and I don't know what the process is. I don't see the pathway how we can wind ourselves out of that without it being quite painful for a lot of people. And that's where I think governments are fairly short term in view, usually around 4 or 5 years, and they just keep kicking the can down the road. And as long as people can make a living, well, that's fine. There's not huge amounts of votes in fishing, albeit that fishing was the kind of the poster boy of the Brexit campaign. But day to day fishing, we know, isn't going to change the political system in this country, and it's almost just keep it ticking over and it'll be fine. And that's a shame. I think it deserves better and could be much better.
Absolutely. Can I ask your experience and views on fishing with tangle nets, gill nets, and hand lines?
Well, hand lines is really where I cut my teeth, and still have 2 boats. One is a 16-foot handline boat, which is used solely for hand lining. So hand lining and actually using hand line as well, not a Gurdy. So hand lining for mackerel, and also for bass. So greatly enjoy both of those techniques, because they require skill and patience. and experience and all the usual ingredients of good fishing that you have to and perseverance you have to use for those. And I think not many people would argue that on the scale which we do it is very, very sustainable. Obviously, we've seen more of a mackerel fishery, and again, it's developed strongly in Shetland and in parts of Scotland, but even down here with bigger boats with jigging machines and strippers and outriggers and all, very effective. But again, I don't worry too much about that. I think that's more of a kind of evolution of the gear type. With netting, again, I've fished with all different types of nets over the years, from the smallest mesh for kind of red mullet and species like that, up to the gear we use for crawfish is a 14-inch mesh, 12.5 or 13, 14-inch, those sort of figures. So a very big mesh size, which we also catch ray. And I must be honest, I love tangle net fishing generally. I think it's a good method. I do believe it shouldn't be open-ended, as we've just talked about with pots. I think there has to be a limit on the amount of static gear, and I believe certainly in this part of the world, the best fishermen with static gear don't have piles and piles of gear. They're good fishermen, so they have the right gear in the right place at the right time, and that's what fishing should be about. It's about using knowledge and skill to use your tool, rather than just plastering the ocean with miles and miles and miles of net or miles of pots. As a method, those methods are probably the ones that I could speak about personally with some experience, that I must admit I like them. I think the right mesh size for gill nets can be very size selective. So you take a certain size of fish or different species of fish, but I guess like any gears, they can be abused. So there are issues, and again, particularly in the north, but ghost fishing, the large Anglo-Spanish fleets or Spanish with miles and miles of gear kind of give static gear a bad name, in my view, or certainly give nets a bad name, because I know it's quite controversial up there.
Oh, it's terrible, and it's exactly as you said. It ends up there's ghost fishing, and they're right now, just now, in the east of Shetlands, and they're from Fair Isle to Flugga. Now that's a long, long sea area, and it's absolutely strewn with them. And the only people that seem to take disused monofilament nets ashore is Scottish boats that catch them in their trawl.
Yeah, no, it's a bit of a scourge on the, it's something that, static gear boats here, we can see, and over the years have been tarred with the same brush, really, for want of a better phrase, and it's not helpful. We can find, because of the emphasis on fish quality and maximizing the value of fish, and limited quotas, what we've found, really, certainly more so inshore but also offshore, is that soak times down here have been reduced. Fishermen are sometimes, we in the bay here, we'll shoot nets for an hour and a half, 2 hours max. The fish are in fantastic condition when they come out of the net, so much shorter soak times. And with, as I was saying, the modern plotters with the maps, the seabed, the sonar charts, the detail that they have, we call it precision fishing, and we say, work smarter, not harder. So just put a small amount of gear in the right place at the right time for the right fish when the prices are good, and land the best quality you can. And that's what static gear should be about. And these people, I think it's almost the opposite. They're just this industrial scale.
That's right. But I think it's the reason I wanted to ask you is because I think you guys down the southwest can prove that it can be sustainable.
Yeah, I think it's like anything I've said. Over the years, I've always been, people are very keen to draw people into debates about big boats versus small boats and different gears. And I like to say that pretty much all gears, not everything, because I think we've touched on one or two that may not be, but most gears, I think, in the right hands, in the right scale, and in the right areas, managed correctly, can be or are sustainable. And I think the hake fishery here, as an example, has got MSC assessment, and some of the other fisheries as well. There's no question that static gear can be done right. but there's also evidence, as we've discussed. There's definitely evidence of when it can be abused, really, and not used right. And I think that we see that all the time in the fishing news and on social media. The behaviour of some of those boats looks to me quite scary. They're not small boats, and when they're dropping floating rope in the water ahead of the bow of some boats, or
that's right.
cutting across them, this is lives we're talking about here, and that's there's no place for that behaviour.
Totally, it's just absolutely shocking, and they seem to get away with it.
It does sadly seem like that. I would say it's been raised, but it doesn't seem to. Organisations like the MCA, who will be the first ones to jump on someone like a ton of bricks because they've got one thing that's not quite right. But some of these bigger issues with the crewing of these vessels and the seamanship and the watchkeeping appears to be borderline illegal, and certainly their actions don't, to me, register as being safe. They don't seem any appetite to prosecute any of these boats.
Yeah, no, definite. Right, here's a question for you. You're at home and you're going to cook a nice meal. What would be your choice and your favourite?
I don't often get a choice, because what I like to do, I guess like a lot of fishermen, I like to eat what I catch. So the first thing my partner says to me, because she's close to a crab addict as you'd get, so she always asks me, like, not what sort of day I've had or anything else, what's the fishing been like, is have you got me any crab? So that's the first kind of thing. So any crab that I catch, I don't get to eat much of that because I'll be boiling it and picking it, because she wants a crab sandwich or crabs. But for me, I say we do have in the tangle nets, we have a bycatch of ray. So I quite like some of the simple stuff, ray wing. But again, when I was really young, I've been less than 10, my uncle and I would fish just in the mouth of the harbour with a rod and small hooks, and we'd be able to catch dabs, and then we'd have dab take back for lunch. So I like some of the simple things, but for me, pretty much almost all the fish I cook, I would have just shallow fried with butter and salt and pepper. I like to have fish simple, but I like having the varied different times of the year. Obviously, we get bass. Fresh mackerel is unbeatable, and I'm talking, an hour or two old fresh. That can be amazing. So I think we get spoilt, but I like to taste the fish. I don't like it too strong.
It's quite. I'm fascinated with your reply about yourself, keeping it simple, because one of the things I found really funny, because I've asked so many different people that question, and you would think it would be the opposite, but I'll ask a skipper. Now, fishermen, as you probably know yourself down there as well, they'll probably be the same. They do enjoy cooking, and they enjoy cooking at home, and they'll take some bits of fish home. And when you're talking to them, they've looked up online or looked in a book and come up with a really complicated dish. They're really seeing themselves as a chef. And then you'll ask the chef, what would you do? Oh, keep it simple. The opposite from what you would expect the chef to the complicated dish.
No, I've been lucky enough. Different things I've had that experience. I've been around people. I don't know, probably like Rick Stein and others over the years, Mitch Tonks and that. And then you're right. Then they always say, and you hear people ask them. People ask, "Well, what would you do with it?" And they just say, "I put that in the pan with some butter, or I do this and that." And it's simple. In my case, I should add, before anyone gets any ideas, in my case, because I'm a terrible cook, so I have to keep it simple, and then I can't go too far wrong.
I know that I met Rick Stein. Well, I know him. I've met him a few times, but he was in Scrabster Fish Market. He was up here doing one of his books, and he was going around the British Isles, and he was in Scrabster, and I thought it was really fascinating because he was watching the sale, the auction was going on, and he spotted this John Dory in a box. And I'm not being critical, I just loved it. But he leaned over to the side towards me and he says, Jim, he says, what do John Dory's sell for here? And I thought, they can say what they like about the chef, but this is a businessman with a
yeah, 100%. Yeah, they would definitely be having an eye on the margin as well.
I love that. But also, when somebody said something about cooking, what I thought was, it's his quote, and I'm going to give him the credits for it. He says, it's not what you do with fish. The important thing is what you don't do.
That's very true. Yeah, and in my case, it's don't burn it.
Yeah. Nathan, where can people and where our listeners follow you online?
I mean, I used to enjoy Twitter, which I think it's called X now, and that's a shame. It was always it could be an unforgiving place, and sometimes the level of debate can be quite low. But I used to quite like Twitter. Maybe not so much now, but I'm still on there. And there's some top skippers on there as well, and I like that. I like the boats now, using satellite broadband can convey so much more of what they do at sea. I think that's been a great thing, and I think there's a few on there. So that's one place. I like Instagram. I like pictures of things, and so my personal account is there, and that's slightly random because that's just a little slice of my life. But the Cornish crawfish was one that that I started on Instagram, kind of for poking fun more than anything else. But so I like to post some stuff on there that just makes people think, or even just a bit funny memes and stuff. But that's the two main places. For more kind of serious, highbrow, then I think LinkedIn is the place. So I kind of use different channels for different things, I suppose. That would be my take on that.
I certainly saw your post on LinkedIn recently about the offshore ones, and I thought, good on you. It needs to be exposed.
Yeah, no, I'd say that's one thing I would say. I've been a fisherman's representative, and I've done different things. And I guess what I enjoy about life now the most is I don't have to toe any party line. I can just say what I think and
Let
what I
her up.
feel. And let rip, yeah. And I think it's an age thing as well. My uncle said to me, and it's unfortunate, we were at a family funeral not long ago, and he's 63, and we lost a cousin of the same age. And I was chatting to him, and I was saying, "Oh, I'm into my 50s now, and I'm getting angry about a lot of things." And he was talking about the offshore wind and other things. I'm getting really frustrated, and I kind of want to fight these things. And he said, that's fine, don't worry about it. He said, I used to be like that when I was in my 50s. He said, but once I got over 60, he said, I don't worry about much now. I'm much more laid back. So I'm hoping at some point I will mellow into the distance.
You should ask him how he feels about Keir Starmer now that he's
I'm sure
that
that'll get
he's
his blood
that
pressure up.
he'll not be so cool and calm when he's got his hand in his pocket for his pension.
No, and he has to find his heating money as well. But no, I'll ask him that. But but no, I say I mean, LinkedIn is a serious place, but it's good, and I say it's good to have respectful challenge, and I think that's the thing that social media sometimes lacks is, and it's you've got these NGOs, the games they play on it, and the power that they have, and the way they do it. It's to say it's the fishing industry against some of these organizations is David and Goliath would be doing David. It's like David with a blindfold on the one hand, towbone on his back. We are a very small industry, and these NGOs, potentially some of them are global and have an enormous power. So it's hard for fishing industry, and it's hard for young fishermen to try and come in and be positive. But we spent last week with some young fishermen in Cornwall, and actually all over the country, part of this young fishermen's network. And that's, for me, I tell you what, that was one of the best things I've done this year, helping some youngish lads learn to scully, because it's a dying art to scull a punt. And there were 3 or 4 that kind of stepped up, had a go, and picked it up pretty good, pretty quick. And if they practice, then I'm sure they'll be fine. So it's good. The future's not as bleak as I thought it was. So that's a positive note, I guess.
The other issue, concern about the environmental NGOs is not it's amount of money that they have at their disposal, and they see the fishing industry as an easy target.
I agree. I mean, there was a good piece of research, and again, I'm going to say it's the NFFO. I might be wrong, but I think it was either Barry Dees or might have been Mike Cohen, but it was on one of their blog posts, and it was something. The headline was something like "Follow the money," but you could see, as you said, the numbers were astronomical. You could run the county of Cornwall on the money that some of these NGOs have at their disposal, and it seems if you follow the money, it's come from industry that maybe have their own dirty secrets, should I say, tobacco, oil and gas. Some of these wealthy trusts and funds, a lot of them from America, seem to be pumping into these NGOs in this country. And then picking on things like fishing, where, the scale of fishing now around our shores is really, I mean, even in my time, I remember going to Peterhead in the late 1990s, just before the cod recovery stuff, so probably 96 or 7, and just being blown away by the harbours up there. Absolutely blown away by the numbers of vessels, the size of the fleet was immense. The same in Brittany as well. I used to go to Brittany at that time, and you can go to Brittany now. You can go to northern Spain, or you can go to Peterhead, and it's for me it's sad. It's a sad reflection on what we have left. So for any environmentalist to be really worried about fishing stuff when there's so many other big issues out there, seems to me almost that they have almost been told what to spend the money on. So but it's certainly not a
And
level
the
playing field in terms of
and
funding.
the and our governments are frightened to argue with them because it'll take them to court, and the fishing industry can't afford that.
And I think for me, I think that is part of the reason why we don't see some of these measures brought in to manage fisheries that maybe we'd like to see, because the government is running scared of judicial review or a court case on almost everything it does, every
Yeah.
single issue around the seas. Well, that can't be. I was talking to a guy the other day, and I said, the HMRC doesn't run scared of football players, as an example. People that earn a lot of money and seem very tax efficient, and it doesn't consult them on tax rules and say, "Oh, what do you think of this?" They go after them. They try their best, and the same with, if you like, drug enforcement, and people, they all go after drug barons, and they'll try and bring in rules, and they'll prevent them. But it seems within fishing and the NGOs, they just seem to be run scared of them. And I think the government could do so much more from a reputational point of view to manage the industry better. They could do so much by defending it and telling the public of all of the good that it's done, the amount of areas that it's closed, and the way that it's managing fish stocks. But it doesn't seem to want to be in that space, doesn't want to be that voice. It lets the fishing industry be that voice. But of course, those words will always be twisted, and the NGOs will say, well, that's the fishermen, that's the industry. They would say that, wouldn't they? And that's a shame. There needs to be more independence.
And no matter what the issue is, they have it down to overfishing.
Every single time, and
Yeah.
even though, we know we've seen huge changes in our own waters in terms of the species. The bluefin tuna fishery that we have coming back down here, and obviously we've not so many years ago the anchovy shoals. So there's no question in my mind that there is some sort of climate shift happening. I think there's probably always through history been some movement in climate, but at the moment the cycle that we're in is as almost all of the gadoids, the cod and the haddock from this way have moved north, and the place seem to be less so. And we're seeing more of the red mullet, the John Dory. Cuttlefish is now is the largest value species probably across the southwest, which 20 odd years ago or more was unheard of. So we're living in changing seas, but the fact is that people will say, "Oh yeah, well, you've overfished those other ones," and I say, "No, it's not purely down to overfishing. There's climate's changed, and the fishing's moved, and so yeah, it's not an easy thing to communicate, because people often don't have the time or the interest to actually get into it. They just want the easy answer, and fishing is bad seems to sell newspapers.
You've a fantastic sea bass fishery. I've had some, and when I've been places, I mean in Hole, and my goodness, a good sea bass. We have quite a few guys beach casting, and maybe sometimes the sea netters catch one. A good size bass for us would be a kilo, and I've seen them with you guys more than double that.
Yeah.
Beautiful fish.
Unfortunately, I've never caught the big ones, but I know, yeah, there's guys certainly fishing, out of the little coves like Penberth, which is, not far from Land's End, Penberth and Sennan, fishing around the Runnelstone and areas like that. Fish, 15, 16, 17 pounds, so, 5, 6, 7 kilos. And that size of fish, the bigger year classes of fish are definitely making a comeback. So and the price that these guys are getting now, because the whole provenance of that fish is being sold much better, that it's line caught, that it's been dipped straight into slush ice and it's sold the next day. And so you have restaurants in London that are crying out for this very very high quality hook and line caught fish. Is fantastic, and it's created a small niche in the industry, but it's those sort of things that have helped put Cornwall on the map. We don't compete at all on volume, but the range of species, and lots of small boat fishermen are very passionate about what they do in terms of the quality, and you'll see some of those guys as well on social media that are promoting their own catch as well. So yeah, it's good, but it's certainly great. The bass, when you see someone can make a day's work out of catching 4 or 5 fish, I mean that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. I've one guy I do follow. I have followed for a while, and he seems a bit of a character too. A guy, Alan Dwan.
Oh yes, yeah, Alan. Know Alan well. I remember Alan when he was living more in Ireland. Obviously now he's a adopted Cornishman, but he was an early adopter down here, really, of social media, and kind of led the way. That whole promotion of hake, when hake really wasn't, it wasn't eaten that much in this country at all. I remember again, going to Rick Steins with Paul Trebilcock, that was the CFPO at the time, and Phil Mitchell, one of the hake skippers, to try and promote hake. And Alan was at the forefront of that kind of marketing work, and yeah, he's certainly worth a follow.
But no, Alan seems a real character.
He is a character, and you should you should ask him if he wants to come on. He's really a character. He's a very good fisherman, actually. Alan Duran. I seen him the other day. I went with Andrew Pascoe. Andrew Pascoe's for me anyway, my generation. He's a good friend of mine, but he's one of the best fishermen of my generation, with all different types of gears, hook and line, net. So obviously in Scotland, and I've heard you talk before about Andrew Bremner and people like that. Andrew Pascoe is our Andrew Bremner, if you like. He's in that league. But anyway, I was there landing fish with him the other day. Took me to catch some tuna, some bluefin tuna, which was quite an experience. And Alan Dwan came along and was chatting to us after, and he's desperate to go for a trip as well with Andrew. So I'm sure he will at some point, and hopefully he'll put that on social media. But yeah, he's a real character. He's a hard weather man. You wouldn't find many harder than Alan, and he's caught his share for sure.
But they even tell me the like of him and that guys on that fishery, they'll take their gear ashore and work on them. There's none of as we talked earlier about this dumped over the side with the Anglo-Spanish and non-UK boats. But it's very responsible and sustainable.
It is, and we've been lucky in Newland that there actually has been a not just a fishing for litter scheme. We had one of them for a few years, but there's also a net recycling scheme. So the boats, they know when they cut out the innards of the mono nets, they've taken away. There's 2 or 3 firms down there now that turn them into something else. Being it, I think one guy was turning them into kind of kayaks and stuff like that. But the costs involved now with static gear, the cost of lead line and the head rope and the netting itself, I don't know anyone that can afford to leave it in the water. It's so expensive. I don't know how they can afford to lose so much value.
Yeah. Are they tagged? Have the buoys or anything like that on them that people can see where their nets are?
Not well, obviously here the buffs and the flag they have to be marked. That's a kind of hangover from EU law. I know the larger netters, the ones that fish in the Irish sector, Irish waters, they're very, very strict on gear marking. But the actual net tags, then no, there isn't a tag per net. Perhaps that's something that would come in if there was ever a restriction trying to limit the number of nets. There'd have to be some form of net tag. I know some of the limited pot fisheries in other countries, they have this tag thing. So no, if the net's lost, then that would be the tag would obviously be the key to tracing it back to its rightful owner. But at the moment, there isn't anything quite like that.
I've spoken to many a skipper up here who says that he'll get a call from one of that guys saying, "Oh, you're towing through my gear," and he can't see the boat. It's miles away.
Yeah, I mean it used to be, going back many years, the bigger boats here, it was all about communication. You'd have to mostly here, although there's obviously local boats, but it would be mostly French boats, French trawlers, if you like, versus Cornish static gear boats. But it was the case you had to go and talk to them individually, and sometimes they'd work a bit of a relationship, and you'd give them the readings, coordinates for a box, and they'd say, "That's fine, I'll stay away from there for a few days," and say what day they wanted to come back. And there was cooperation around to try and avoid kind of gear conflict. But as you say, with the quantities of gear now, some of these boats are working, they're not even on the horizon, they're nowhere to be seen, and the gears, they get dumped. But the funny thing you say about that is I saw a guy that I know that was skippering a beam trawler, and someone was texting him saying the same as what you're saying. "Oh yeah, you're towing through my gear." And the boat wasn't even at sea, but because he had AIS on, he was must have had it at home plotted, and he was telling him as it was. He wasn't anywhere near it, but he had this guy, sending him all these messages, and you just think, wow, it's a different ballgame. I mean, the stories, I never saw it myself, but the stories here of the netters was they would scribble down their reading, probably in Decker in those days, on a piece of paper on a tally in the wheelhouse, and wrap it around a potato, and then lob the potato at the French trawler, and they'd unravel it and have the numbers. And often they'd lob the potato back, probably with a bit of topspin. But that's how communication was done back in the day. But now you say AIS and SATC and SatPhone has made it probably much better, but probably less interesting, less fun.
Oh, thank you. Well, Nathan, I would just like to be maybe a good time to fold it up, and just like to thank you so much. I really enjoyed our chat very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, it's been lovely to chat and reminisce and tell a few stories. So thank you for indulging me.
The world loves a story.
It does indeed.